Welcome everyone to this side event of the 66th session of the Commission of the Status of Women on Gender, Climate and Security, the Just Transition Towards Peace and Prosperity. My name is Neda Salmanpour. I am the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Global Peace and Prosperity Forum. This side event is co-sponsored by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the European Commission, the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, with the Global Peace and Prosperity Forum. As the world confronts rapidly accelerating threats of climate change and conflict and the gendered impacts they generate, the triple nexus of gender inequality, state fragility, and climate vulnerability, and the challenges they present to the well-being of our communities and the ecosystems upon which we depend is becoming patently clear. Climate change, the ultimate threat multiplier, is a defining threat of the 21st century. In already fragile contexts, the impacts of climate change can exacerbate conditions that threaten security, such as loss of livelihoods or competition of scarce resources. At the same time, conflict and insecurity undermine resilience to external shocks and make adapting to the impacts of a changing climate more challenging. However, recognizing the gender dimensions of security and climate issues is not only essential to understand the different ways in which women and marginalized groups experience and manage these risks, but also has tremendous implications for the promotion of gender equality, the mitigation of climate change, and the advancement of peace and security. Gender scholars have established in one of the most important social science findings of the past 2 decades that gender inequality is strongly associated with instability and conflict, both within and between countries. Gender scholars have also shown that gender factors are critical to the development of effective adaptation and mitigation policies as climate change progresses. If policies and programs are gender blind when addressing climate-related security risks, or climate blind to women, peace and security programming, they can exacerbate the vulnerabilities of groups most exposed to the impacts of climate change, deepen existing inequalities, and potentially aggravate environmental and security threats. Ignoring gender, therefore, is misguided not just in terms of gender outcomes, but for security and stability outcomes as well. It is therefore important to have an integrated three-way approach to gender, climate change, and security. This will provide the analytical foundation that will be needed for policies that can advance all three priorities essential to humanity: gender equality, sustainable development, and the promotion of peace and security. Today, we are privileged and delighted to have distinguished speakers who will help us unpack the triple nexus of gender, climate, and security and explore effective pathways to transition towards just, peaceful, and sustainable societies. We are privileged that our first keynote address is by Ms. Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ms. Patricia Espinosa took office in 2018 as the Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the Convention of Climate Change. Prior to that, she served as Ambassador of Mexico to Germany since 2012, and from 2001 to 2002 was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico from 2006 to 2012. With more than 30 years of experience at the highest levels in international relations, Ms. Espinosa's specialization was and is in climate change, global governance, sustainable development, gender equality, and protection of human rights. She was the elected chair of the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly in 1996, where she played a key role in the process leading to the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action at the Fourth World Conference on Women.
Dear friends, it's a pleasure to be here. Global peace and prosperity are the topics of this particular forum and represent our elusive human endeavor. Humanity is a species with unlimited potential to achieve incredible progress in innumerable areas, but we often become our own worst enemies with respect to achieving that progress. We have dramatically reduced extreme poverty globally in the last half-century. Millions have achieved higher standards of living. Technology has advanced at incredible rates. We have had periods of relative peace and, for some, reasonable prosperity. Yet, our instincts often overcome our better judgments. War instead of peace. Separation instead of equality. Judgment instead of compassion. Great challenges face us today, as they always have. This includes direct conflicts between nations which, as they always do, set back gender equality gains while having a devastating impact on populations. Beyond those immediate challenges, however, is the specter of climate change, an existential emergency unprecedented in modern times. We are tasked with the global challenge of addressing rapidly advancing climate change, a challenge for which humanity bears responsibility. A threat multiplier, climate change exacerbates most challenges humanity faces, ranging from security, poverty, justice, equality, and more. The science clearly lays out the goals we must achieve. We must reduce emissions 45% by the end of this decade, achieve climate neutrality by mid-century, and limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. Let me outline the challenge from the UN climate change perspective and how we are trying to move forward. The UNFCCC is a country-driven process, and countries have sole discretion as to who is represented in their national delegation. So we see that the representation of women is often reflective of what is happening at national and local levels. Parties to the UNFCCC adopted a goal of gender balance in national delegations and in national climate policy and action in 2012. And since then, the Secretariat has reported annually on the gender composition of national delegations and policy and decision-making bodies under the UNFCCC and subsequently the Paris Agreement. There have also been technical reports and other measures taken at the international level to highlight the overrepresentation of men in the international climate process. We have seen some progress, but let me be blunt with you. What I see is disappointing. A case in point was the recent COP26 climate negotiations in Glasgow. I couldn't help but think, as I looked beside me on the podium during the final plenary discussions in Glasgow, where were all the other women? It was similar when I looked into the audience. I saw many women, but I knew that only a third of them were lead negotiators. Yet, there was a different picture available. One taken on Women's Leadership Day. I was part of it. There was a moment where all female leaders got together for a group photo. It was truly remarkable. I joined other women leaders such as Teresa Rivera, Mary Robinson, Nicola Sturgeon, and these were only a few examples of so many. It's time the two pictures matched. The one at the final plenary and the picture on Women's Leadership Day. And it's time we saw more women in leadership at all levels and in both the private and public sector. It's 2022, not 1822. To be clear, this is not the job of women alone. It's why I will, in addition to the formal process, continue to call upon those in positions of power to step up take notice and facilitate opportunities for talented, skilled women and girls in all their diversity to lead. It's time for countries to be deliberate in how they seek to achieve gender parity in local, national, and international climate policy and decision-making roles. We have got to get beyond these very general statements that they will continue to strive for equal representation and see more, here's exactly how we will achieve it and here's when. Let's be clear that no country has yet achieved gender equality. The same applies to many corporations and businesses. Much more work remains. Yet there have been some success stories. We must look to best practices in other sectors, countries, or businesses where gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment has advanced and concrete measures have been put in place. Measures might include a written policy, formal targets or quotas, performance indicators for senior leaders, and most likely a combination of measures is required. Dear friends, my message to you is this. It is critical to address gender equality and climate change holistically because they are inextricably linked. If we can get it right, we have an incredible opportunity to effect incredible change, and that includes finding lasting peace. Progress is possible. I've seen it in my lifetime. I remember the first World Conference of the International Women's Year in Mexico City back in 1975. I was proud of my city for hosting the event, and while I knew we had so far to go on gender issues, it was remarkable that the need for work was finally being undertaken at a higher level. Imagine my honor then, when I was at the Mexican mission in New York 2 decades later, to have the chance to be part of the team leading discussions at the conference in Beijing in 1995. The results from that conference have reverberated internationally, were reflected in the Paris Agreement, and led to some greater inclusion. I wish I could tell you it was comprehensive and fast-moving. But the point is that we continue to move forward and that we continue to make progress. Our work is never in vain. We face a monumental struggle in difficult times, but we will and must get through this. Half measures will not help us deal with climate change, nor will only including half the global population. We can and must do better. I thank you for participating in this event, and I look forward to working with all of you towards our everlasting objective, achieving peace and prosperity for all people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Espinosa, for such a wonderful message and framing the discussion of gender equality in terms of climate change. Our next speaker is Commissioner Dali. I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, Commissioner Dali. She is the first EU Commissioner for Equality since December 2019. Commissioner Dali's role is to deliver on the Union of Equality chapter within the political guidelines of President von der Leyen by strengthening Europe's commitment to equality and inclusion in all of its senses. Prior to taking her role as Commissioner, Commissioner Dali held various political roles in Malta, including Member of Parliament from 1996 to 2019, as Minister for European Affairs and Equality from 2017 to 2019, and Minister for Social Dialogue, Consumer Affairs and Civil Liberties from 2013 to 2017. She was also Opposition Shadow Minister for Public Administration, Equality, Public Broadcasting, National Investments from 1998 to 2013. We will now have the keynote address.
No crisis is gender neutral, and this includes the climate crisis. The consequences of climate change and environmental degradation continue to take a disproportionate toll on women, whose access to resources remains more precarious than men. To address this problem, the EU put social justice and gender mainstreaming at the heart of the European Green Deal. The EU climate adaptation strategy ensures that the implementation of the measures considers the different skills, talents, and knowledge of women and men in all their diversity. The European Climate Pact aims at increasing women's leadership and gender balance amongst EU climate ambassadors. We support programs across the world that promote women's participation in climate and environmental governance, such as the Euroclima Plus program. Through a disaster risk reduction approach, the EU seeks to strengthen the capacity of women and girls by preparing them early to address their specific needs. It is also important to acknowledge the links between environmental degradation, climate change and disasters on the one hand, and gender-based violence on the other. This is why the EU is an active member of the Call to Action on Protection from Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies, and we fund targeted actions aimed at preventing and responding to gender-based violence. Furthermore, the EU-UN Spotlight Initiative continues to strengthen institutional capacity to systematically address violence against women and girls following disasters. Women and girls must be agents of change and drivers of sustainable solutions. A greener, safer, and equal world is possible if we implement gender mainstreaming in our global sustainability effort.
Thank you, Commissioner Dali, for such a wonderful introduction. We now have our panel. We are privileged and delighted to have a distinguished panel to help us unpack the triple nexus of gender, climate, and security and explore the pathways to transition towards just and peaceful, sustainable societies. Our first speaker is Ms. Reem Al-Salim from Jordan. Ms. Reem Al-Salim was appointed as Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Its Causes and Consequences by the United Human Rights Council in July 2021 to recommend measures, ways and means at the national, regional and international levels to eliminate violence against women and its causes and to remedy its consequences. She holds a Master in International Relations from the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and a Master's in Human Rights Law from the University of Oxford. She's an independent consultant on gender issues, the rights of refugees and migrants, and transitional justice and humanitarian response. Unfortunately, Reem was unable to join us at the last minute, but she has prepared her presentation on video, which I can now share with you.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I sincerely regret my inability to be with you in person today due to a conflict in my schedule. We all know that women and girls are often disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of the climate crisis, owing to pre-existing, deep-rooted and persisting gender inequalities and discrimination. We also know that the sudden onset of natural disasters, as well as the slow environmental degradation and displacement linked to the climate crisis, seriously affect women and girls' access to food and nutrition, safe drinking water and sanitation, healthcare services and medicines, education and training, adequate housing, access to land, access to decent work, and labor protection. Not to mention the fact that it is widely recognized by now that climate change is a serious aggravator or multiplier of all types of gender-based violence against women and girls. And as the 2019 OHCHR study demonstrated, climate change is set to further exacerbate the already increasing number of complex emergencies which disproportionately affect women and girls. The CEDAW committee had already drawn attention to this relationship between gender-based violence and climate change in its general recommendation number 37 of 2018. It is as if the committee could see into the future when it warned us 5 years ago that women and girls are often at greater risk of violence after disasters, in the absence of social protection schemes and situations in which there is severe food insecurity as they attempt to gain access to livelihood for themselves and their family members. The committee also had highlighted that the risks of violence in camps and temporary settlements are exacerbated and notes that domestic violence, child, early or forced marriages, trafficking in persons, and forced prostitution are more likely to occur during and following disasters. All these are forms of gender-based violence. We know from studying the aftermath of large-scale disasters that this is also the case in reality. Data from around the world shows that in the aftermath of climate-induced disasters, such as tropical storms, severe flooding, and landslides, women and girls face heightened risk of rape, sexual assault, harassment, intimate partner violence, as well as I said, child marriage and trafficking. We also know that the sudden and slow onset of disasters and environmental degradation causes displacement, and that forced displacement exacerbates violence against women and girls by definition. Now, I'm reassured about the international attention that is being given to the impacts of climate crisis on women and girls, and gender equality, and the need for participation of women and girls, and the fact that these elements are integrated into approaches to adaptation and mitigation policies, as well as actions to address loss and damage associated with the impacts of the climate crisis. However, there is no doubt that more needs to be done to really place women and girls center stage when it comes to the design and implementation of these policies by ensuring equal participation and decision-making in them. That will obviously be challenging since most decision makers and most players in the governance space that address climate change are still men. Also, as I have said before, insufficient attention has been given to how climate crisis is exacerbating gender-based violence. There's still a lot we do not know and we do not understand. For example, how it precisely affects different groups of women that have already been exposed to the risk of violence, such as women and girls with disabilities, women and girls that are indigenous, migrant women and girls, and so forth. Some of them are all these things at once, so a better understanding of the intersectionality is required. And of course, the sixth assessment of the IPCC on impacts, adaptations, and vulnerabilities has already laid some of the important groundwork, flagging some of the groups that are most at risks, and which include the ones I mentioned, which are indigenous women and girls, but also older women, amongst others. The other thing that we need to get a better grip on is how exactly gender-based violence is exacerbated by the climate crisis and how it manifests itself. We know that due to the erosion of means of livelihood, water and natural resources, women in communities that depend on agriculture, fishing, cattle herding are increasingly forced to have sex in exchange for access to sources of livelihood, which are becoming more and more scarce. Many are also raped while walking further distances in search of firewood. Others are forced to marry off their daughters as coping strategies in the face of food and livelihood scarcity. Most importantly, however, we do not know how decisions as to what and how to finance the climate crisis mitigation, adaptation, and response will affect funds available for the prevention and ending gender-based violence against women and girls. Now, finally, available research also shows that in those areas where there are extractive industries, forms of violence against women and girls tend to increase, whether it is sexual exploitation, attacks and killings of women, environment and human rights defenders, or domestic violence. The question is, how are states rising to the occasion of preventing violence by these industries? I ask because the CEDAW Committee General Recommendation 37 makes it clear that according to the CEDAW Convention, state parties are obliged to regulate the activities of non-state actors within their jurisdiction, including when they operate extraterritorially. And Article 2 of CEDAW requires states to eliminate discrimination by any actor, whether that actor is private or public. If we have learned any lessons of the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has some elements in common with the climate crisis, such as the immediacy and urgency it poses, its life-threatening and borderless qualities, then we should already be putting in place measures to ensure that our prevention and response policies are not gender-blind. It has also highlighted that designing any strategies without the full participation of half of society is destined to fail. Hopefully this time around, we are not considering a gender responsiveness as an afterthought, but we are placing it front and center in the planning and in the response. Thank you.
We thank Reem for very comprehensive opening remarks, and we miss her for not being here, but we're grateful that she was able to share with us her presentation. Our next speaker is Professor Payam Akhavan. Professor Akhavan is Professor of International Law and Senior Fellow of Massey College, University of Toronto, and member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. He is also counsel of the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law. He was previously legal advisor to the Prosecutor's Office of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, counsel before the International Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, and special advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, with prior academic appointments at McGill University, Sciences Po and University Paris Nanterre, Oxford University, Yale Law School, and the European University Institute. He is the recipient of the 2021 Human Rights Award of the Law Society of Ontario. Ayaan, please.
Thank you very much, Neda. I'm grateful to the Global Peace and Prosperity Forum and the other co-sponsors for inviting me to be the lonely man on this panel of very eminent and distinguished women. And I do wish to say at the outset how important it is for men to assume responsibility for the cause of gender equality, because the lack of gender equality is oppressive not just to women, but also to men who are blighted from realizing their potential as well in a society in which principles of violence, domination, and inequity prevail. Following the three earlier presentations, and in particular the remarks of the Special Rapporteur on violence against women, I wish to focus on her reference to the question of loss and damages for climate change. And also her reference to, in that case, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the obligations that states have of what is called due diligence, of taking affirmative actions to provide protection to women. So I'm going to look at this from a slightly different perspective of climate justice and a remarkable initiative of small island states to invoke international law to change the conversation about climate change. And I believe this is particularly relevant to the question of gender equality. And I've referred to the summary which you have provided in the invitation to this event of how the issue of gender equality relates to climate justice. And there is one sentence in particular where you refer to the fact that the most vulnerable segments of the Earth's population will be on the front line of global warming. And the principle of justice, including intergenerational justice, as well as the ethics of care for people and the planet, must be the imperative of collective response. And of course, for those of us in academia, we know that the ethics of care is one of the sort of fundamental themes which emerges from feminist approaches, feminist epistemology. So turning to the most vulnerable, the small island states are the proverbial canary in the coal mine of climate change. They are at the front lines of bearing the brunt of what the rest of humanity will face in the not too distant future. And many of the small island states, countries such as Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Maldives, are literally going to disappear, some of them within the foreseeable future, as a result of rising sea levels. So when you think about an entire nation which is about to become extinct, you think, what does it mean for those people? How does that shape their understanding of the urgency with which we need to act because of the scientific certainty that what is happening to those small island nations will happen to the rest of us in due course? In 1991, the Alliance of Small Island States, known as Eosis, was established with the leadership of the Maldives. And this was just 3 years after the NASA scientist James Hansen popularized the term global warming in his testimony before the US Congress. And it was the following year at the Rio Earth Summit that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. Article 3 of that convention provides for the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. On the one hand, it recognizes that confronting climate change is the common responsibility of the entire international community. But it recognizes that there are differentiated responsibilities because the major polluters have greater responsibilities than those societies, most often in the global south, most often underdeveloped countries that contribute a negligible fraction of the global carbon emissions, but which very often bear a disproportionate share of the consequences. And that is exactly the story of the small island states. From the very beginning, the small island states wish to put loss and damages on the agenda of the so-called COP process under the UN Framework Convention. And for 26 years, they have failed to do so, most recently at COP26 in Glasgow. Now, the basic principle in international environmental law is very simple. It goes back to the due diligence principle. A state cannot allow its territory to be used in a way that causes harm to other states. There is a famous called Trail Smelter Arbitration from 1938 between Canada and the United States. It involved a smelter in British Columbia, Canada, that in respect of producing iron ore was spewing sulfur dioxide fumes through a chimney, which was then carried by the wind across the border into the United States. And it created tremendous environmental damage, whether for the agricultural sector or wildlife and forests. So this arbitration established the principle that you must exercise due diligence not to allow activities on your territory to cause harm to others. So the question is, if we accept that principle in respect of noxious fumes from a factory chimney, or in respect of someone dumping toxic waste off the coast of a state, why do we not apply it to the context of global warming? Why should global warming as a form of environmental damage or pollution be any different? And the principle that I think captures the simple truth is the polluter pays. You pollute, you pay. That is been the principle in international law for more than a century. So turning back to COP26, a group of small island states, in particular the prime ministers of the Caribbean nation of Antigua and Barbuda and the Pacific state of Tuvalu, decided on the first day of COP26, because of their frustration at vague and empty promises and commitments, to establish a commission of small island states on climate change and international law, with a view to having recourse to international courts and tribunals, with a view to the progressive development of international law. And this goes back to what you refer to in your framing of the issue of gender equality and climate change to the question of justice and equity. It is not simply an act of God or force of nature which has brought us to the precipice of collective disaster and self-destruction. It is political choices, in particular by major polluters, that remain indifferent to the urgency with which we need to radically transform our values and our behaviors, not just so we can have a better world, but so we can prevent our collective extinction. And Arnold Toynbee famously said that civilizations are not murdered, they commit suicide. And of course, as an eminent historian, one should really take very seriously the idea that we are, if we continue business as usual, on the path of self-destruction. So it's remarkable to see that the smallest of nations on earth, Antigua and Barbuda has a population of about 80,000. Tuvalu has a population of just 12,000. So the leaders of these smallest of nations are speaking truth to power. They are invoking international law to change the conversation. And if we really believe in a rule-oriented international order, not just as some platitude, an empty platitude, but if we seriously believe in it, then we should all support this initiative so that we begin to address this issue through the framework of binding legal obligations rather than wishful thinking and empty promises. And I would just end by saying that this is not about small island states engaging in adversarial relations with other nations. In fact, these leaders are engaging in what I call planetary politics. They are trying to save themselves and save all of humankind at the same time. So I hope that a small initiative, which I've outlined now, may be of interest and worthy of support by all those constructive forces that wish to now change the conversation on climate change. And I thank you once again for inviting me to sit alongside these very distinguished and outstanding women on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Achavan, for such a comprehensive and in sharing with us these new developments that are happening as we speak. Our next speaker is Dr. Renata Giannini. She is a senior researcher at the Grappa Institute. She has carried out consultancies with the World Bank, United Nations Development Programme, and the Latin America Defense and Security Network on issues ranging from border security, conflict-related sexual violence, and the gendered impact of infrastructure projects, among others. She is a gender specialist and has facilitated gender training to multiple defense, police, and international organizations, including the Brazilian Peacekeeping Training Center, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the United Nations, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, we know as OSCE. In Brazil, she was a member of the working group tasked with the responsibility of drafting Brazil's National Action Plan and consults with the government on the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Her latest publications are on violence against women, environmental defenders in the Amazon, violence against women and girls in urban settings, the women, peace and security agenda, and the closure of civic space. Renata.
Thank you very much. So first and foremost, I really would like to thank you for the opportunity for being here today in the company of these distinguished women and men who are making a difference to our planet and to our own existence. But perhaps, and especially after you've read my bio, is also to explain a little bit my background and exactly what I'm doing here. I'm an expert on the women, peace and security agenda, and for nearly 2 decades, I've been mostly focusing on highlighting the experience of women in conflicts and how they can be agents of transformation. I am from Rio de Janeiro, and I work at the Garapé Institute, which is a small think and do tank dedicated to influencing public policies on the areas of public security, digital security, and climate security, as well as its impacts on democracy. So that has led me to try to investigate how we could address women's disproportionate burden when it comes to a country, Brazil, where there's not a recognized or a declared conflict taking place. But we know that there are many undeclared conflicts in Brazil, in Latin America, and in other parts of the world. And we should discuss the impact of those not only on women and other marginalized groups, but also on the environment and the people responsible for protecting it. Brazil ranks fourth when it comes to violence against the defenders around the globe. And according to a survey done by Global Witness, only in 2020, 20 human rights and environmental defenders were assassinated in Brazil. So most of these deaths are the result of conflicts involving disputes and protection of territories against deforestation to illegal logging, the expansion of agribusinesses and illegal mining, and against very large infrastructure projects and extractivist industry that has an enormous potential to destroy the environment. But around the world, women are the main defenders of the environment and of natural resources. They act in the front line of expropriations, in the defense of sustainable agriculture and other forms of production, consumption, and social organization. That's how, as defenders of the forest, the bioma, and the people who live there, that they have become a target of many different kinds of violence. So, as a result, not only women and certain groups in the forest are disproportionately affected by climate change, they are also subjected to different forms of violence as a result of their very activism. So, these actions, they are intended to curtail their voice, to censor them, and to take them out of the fight, to take them out of their own causes. So, as a result, this violence against women defenders is not only targeting the women themselves, but it's posing a direct threat to the global commons. In the Brazilian Amazon, the situation is not different. That's the region where most of the violence against defenders takes place. So, in fact, there's a research by another organization that mapped over 106,000 conflicts across Brazil. And 62.5% of those conflicts were within the Brazilian Amazon. So we carried out a research at the Adaptation Institute with women defenders. And what we learned is that 8 in each 10 defenders in the Amazon have already suffered violence. Most of them highlighted moral violence and the impact on their reputation, and especially on mental health. Physical violence, harassment, and psychological abuse against them and their families were also highlighted. Some types of violence against women defenders are just invisible. So it's invisible to the state because it fails to understand, to document, and address it through specifically tailored public policies. And it's invisible to the society that fails to see both the violence against them and also the agency that these women really have. So this invisibility affects all women, but some are more invisible than others. Violence against women defenders in the Amazon have a disproportionate impact on traditional vulnerable groups in the same place, such as the traditional Black communities known as Quilombola, the Indigenous communities, and other types of traditional fishing and rural communities. This is why when we think about violence against women defenders in the Amazon, we must address the issue of climate justice and women's economic empowerment. Two-thirds of the time, women are disproportionately affected by climate-related disasters. It's the correlation that we're talking here. So we've talked about the correlation between gender equality and conflict, but there's here another correlation, which is between gender equality, or better, gender inequality and climate change. So we look into the data. The greater the inequality, also the higher the risks of climate-related disasters. And the same thing is for the solutions. So women are responsible for many things, but they are overrepresented in agricultural development and also leading the way, for example, on renewable energy. So we should be financing women entrepreneurship in order to address climate insecurity as well. The environment is one of the global commons, but it affects us differently, as we know. And the women in the Amazon really are in the front line of care. They're also the main victims of both domestic violence and political violence in the region. We have a platform that tracks violence against women, and it shows that the Amazonian women are among the main victims of sexual violence and homicides. As both illicit, state-sponsored and state-authorized activities continue to expand into the forest areas, a concerted effort between government, society, and multilaterals need to take place and need to render visible the role that women defenders play protecting the forest and protecting the people living within it. Because targeting them is also targeting the environment. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please make sure everyone's on mute because we can hear some background noise and I'm not sure where it's coming from. Thank you very much for that. So we're into our Q&A session, and there are a couple of questions coming in. So let me just go first to the ones that have been sent before. There's one to Professor Ahavan. There's here that the global climate crisis we heard is going to displace billions of people in the near future. And there is the Ecological Threat Register conducted by Sydney-based Institute for Economics and Peace projected that as many as 1.2 billion people could be displaced by 2050, and that no country is able to escape the impact of climate crisis. And we just heard recently from the Secretary General that all countries are now affected by climate crisis. So in this scenario, advancing gender equality in the context of climate crisis and disaster risk reduction is one of the greatest global challenges of the 21st century. Could you expand on the correlation? You touched upon it, but could you expand a bit more on the correlation between gender justice and climate justice, and how international law can integrate on gender perspectives to develop the principle of justice?
Well, that's a very important question, and I'm not sure I can do justice to it in the small amount of time that we have. But I think it goes back, Neda, to what I quoted earlier from your very well-written summary of the way in which we can frame the issue of climate justice in light of what you referred to as sort of stereotypically, as you put it, feminine ideals as opposed to masculine ideals. And I think that's why in the beginning I said that we need to understand that gender equality is also a very serious issue for men, not just for women, because it's about values. It's not just about women versus men. It's about the values based on which we govern the planet. And if those values are narcissistic, sort of greed-driven, based on violence, domination, disregard for the consequences of our actions on others, well, then we have this really shocking dystopian future of more than 1 billion people being displaced, massive consequences on food security, rising sea levels, ocean acidification, and the list goes on and on. So from that point of view, I think that international law as it exists today will be radically transformed in the coming years because we have no choice. We go back to international human rights law, which was virtually non-existent under the League of Nations. And then after the Second World War, when the UN Charter was adopted in 1945, when the Nuremberg Charter for the prosecution of Nazi leaders introduced the concept of crimes against humanity, when in 1948, the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of a sudden, international law was revolutionized from this state-centric to a human-centric international order. Since then, human dignity has become a foundational principle of global governance, at least in principle, if not in practice. So now I think we're going to undergo a shift from an anthropocentric to a nature-centric international legal order. Because in effect, we have this hubris, this incredible arrogance about being at the center of the universe, rather than understanding that, in fact, we're just an insignificant speck in an infinite universe, a sort of a spiritual, sacred conception of our place in creation, which many indigenous traditions have a profound understanding of, including some of the persecuted indigenous groups in Amazonia that Dr. Renata was addressing. They understand better than anyone else that if we destroy their home today, we will destroy our own home tomorrow, because we are all inextricably interdependent. Our welfare is inseparable. So I think in that sense, we need to reimagine international law, and with it, the entire idea that we have about global governance, seeking short-term gain with willful blindness towards the consequences of our actions is not just going to create harm, but it will pit humankind in a contest against Mother Nature. And guess who's going to win that contest? Mother Nature is going to win. Our species is going to become extinct. So I'm not sure if that really addresses the question, but I will just end with one small reflection as a legal scholar of a colleague of mine here in Canada, who's a scholar of Indigenous law, and he presents the Indigenous conception of law from his particular perspective as one of imitating the earth. He says the earth is the source of law. We should look at the cycles of nature, the passing of the seasons, the interdependence of all creation, and we should create our laws and norms based on the perfect majesty of nature. And maybe to the cynical decision makers and sophisticated intellectuals, that may seem simplistic and naive. And guess what? It's not simplistic and naive. It is an inescapable truth, and we're about to learn it the hard way unless we, through an act of vision and volition, bring about the changes that are necessary. We will be forced to do so in the very near future after suffering catastrophic damages.
Thank you for that. It's I think this is so important, and that's how it sort of, I think, relates to gender equality and the way not just the Indigenous women, but all women are devalued for the care work that they give. And that's becoming now that everyone's realizing how important it is, because that essential care, the value of care, which is taken out in every other aspect of life, law, theory, economics, policy, politics. If you take that out, this is what we're left with: extraction, domination, profit over everything else. So we're now beginning to understand why it's so important for men to be engaging in care work early on in the family, so that they can continue nurturing this idea of care and develop it in all aspects of their life: social, economic, political. Thank you very much. If I can turn to Renata. There was a question earlier, and please also look at the chat and the Q&A box for what others are also asking. We just heard from Reem and from yourself in terms of it's important to recognize the difference in the way women and men differently are affected by climate change and conflict, and that gender equality perspective should be applied in the field of climate change and security policy. And some of the concerns raised by Reem and your staff included the high prevalence of violence against women and girls, which worsen in climate and environmental crisis disasters, women's lack of rights and access and control over resources, particularly land, which weaken their adaptive capacities, increase their insecurity, and limit their livelihood opportunities, as well as their decision-making powers on the use of these resources, and their dependence on the informal economy, which also during conflicts in climate, they lose any sense of social protections, which make them even more vulnerable to gender-based violence, especially in the extractive settings. In consequence, women are often described as victims, but we also know that women are agents of change. Can you share with us in what ways women are agents of change in adaptation strategies and climate resilience?
Thank you for the question. It's one of I will start actually by not. I think I'm not answering, but just talking a little bit another challenge from the questions that I see here about more ambitious nationally determined contributions for that was called for COP27, and I think that's the very, very challenge, because we've known for a really long time what the solution is. We know that. And when it comes to women, we know that disseminating, promoting gender equality, it's not only good for women, it's actually the solution of major challenges that we are confronting nowadays, of wars and of environmental disasters. It's just part of the solution. And yet we're not able to do anything. And that's what really, all the time, it's something that really, it hurts me, because I don't know what we could do. But anyway, coming from talking a little bit more about my experience in the Amazon, most of the experiences of women is just invisible. And they perform several roles that are directly related to the protection of the forest, not only because the way that they perform agriculture is sustainable, but also because they really put sometimes their bodies to defend their territories. In Brazil, since 1988, some indigenous groups and quilombola communities, which is this Black traditional communities, they have managed to secure land for themselves. Now, since then, and despite the Constitution, there have been many enterprises against that, be it from the state, be it from legal groups, be it from businesses, from the private sector. And what we see that the ones who are really defending these territories, putting their bodies as a way to defend it, to impede the people from coming, are the women, and they really are in the front line. They are leading syndicates, they are leading social movements, and what I think is worse is not only that these agencies is completely invisible, that most of the way that we ended up finding to protect them when they are threatened is by taking them out of their territories, is by really stripping them from the right of living wherever they want. So this is just a few words that I wanted to share from the experience that I'm having actually of the defenders in the Amazon.
There's actually one question in the chat which says, what can we do to help support the persecuted environmental defenders, especially the women activists? I know the special rapporteur has, highlights this, but what can everyone else do? I think this is a question. That's expand a bit.
Yes, of course. I think the very first thing is to hear them. So one of the things that we're looking into is what's the protection programs look like? Because these women are receiving several different kinds of threats. And we know in advance that their lives are at risk. And what are we doing to protect them? And most of the protection programs really are focused on removing them from there, rather than really protecting or hearing them or empowering them. I think that the first step is hearing them, and the second step is economic empowerment, because economic empowerment has a direct correlation with the possibility of them acting and of them being the agents of change that they should be. So most of the
Perhaps I could bring in Dr. Achava, maybe because he's also a human rights defender, although a male in this instance, but he obviously will be also experiencing this kind of backlash. How can what can people do to support human rights defenders and especially on the environment frontline, because they face corporations and, powerful organizations who have a lot behind them?
Well, yes, and in responding to that question, there is also one of the remarks in the chat, which I think relates to it more broadly. And the comment is to the effect that international law is fantastic, but we need to address the global neoliberal agenda that focuses on production and consumption. And I would sort of vigorously agree and say that the two are inextricably interrelated. The international legal order, its inherent weakness, is a reflection of those materialistic values. So the reason why we don't have an environmental regime with teeth, with enforcement mechanisms, with exact obligations, rather than nationally determined contributions without any enforcement mechanism, is because governments don't want their hands to be tied. Because ultimately, production, consumption, and the traditional now wholly anachronistic ideas that we have about how you produce value, how you measure progress, are still being stubbornly protected, despite the fact that their inadequacy is manifestly apparent. So getting back to the question of human rights defenders, vulnerable peoples, indigenous peoples, women, all sorts of marginalizations that are occurring as a result of this, what I call the gospel of greed, right? We go back to the 1980s, the years of President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher, and the neoliberal agenda going overboard. And today we are several decades later paying the consequences of a purely materialistic conception of civilization. And that has to do with the fact that we need to awaken people's consciousness. We need to make these into central political issues, whether it's the persecution of human rights defenders, usurpation of indigenous lands, and one just go on and on. Powerful elites count on people's ignorance and indifference to continue business as usual. And until people take their own responsibility and agency seriously, we're not going to be able to affect change except by reaching our environmental limits and reaching a point where these disasters leave no choice, including for the elites, to change. But I think we can do better than that. And I always like to quote this famous saying that all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. I'm a former war crimes prosecutor. I've always dealt with crimes against humanity and genocide and these sort of evils, which we see today unfolding in the war in Ukraine. We saw it in Rwanda. We saw it in Bosnia. And we're shocked by the scenes of pregnant women being killed in a maternity ward or what have you. And we're shocked into caring, at least momentarily. We want to say, this is wrong. What can I do? I want to become involved. But what we're witnessing is a much greater cataclysm happening in slow motion. Because if we talk about genocide as the destruction of a particular minority group, we are experiencing through climate change omnicide being the destruction of the entire human species. So it goes back, I think, to nurturing spiritual values, a sense of the sacred, a deeper understanding of human dignity. And in fact, our civilization is addicted to consumerism, because we are sleepwalking into our own destruction. We know what the science is. No one can deny it, but we're sweeping it under the carpet in the name of wishful thinking, willful blindness, simply because we are addicted. And we need to end that addiction. We need to accept that we have to sacrifice something to bring about change. There is a price to be paid. You can't just continue business as usual.
Thank you very much. There is a question, as you've touched upon, the displacements that we're witnessing, and the question, because we see it that happen with climate-related or conflict-related, and usually, obviously, women and children are the most affected. And the question is, what can be done to mitigate the serious implications for women in societies and peace and security? What can for people who are displaced or made stateless, who end up facing gender-based violence? Wants to answer that question? Renata, or
I can start. Yes, of course. I can start. We know that women are disproportionately affected by migration. It's interesting. We've done a research not long ago in Brazil about the different nationalities, and women were among the majority of the displaced people that had arrived in Brazil, except for when we would consider the Syrian migrants. And the main reason being that it's only the distance, but women are most affected by, close by or internal displacement. If there is an investment from the family to make in someone to get saved, it's usually the men who will go to further distances. And when we talked to most of these women, the key challenges that they had really were with sexualized violence, really were about how they would provide for the family and get economic income in places where most of the times they were not even being able to get any sort of document of ID. So I think that the first step really is to recognize women migrants as with the same rights as rights of citizens themselves, so they can access the services that are available to other citizens. And this has been really one of the greatest challenges with Venezuelan women arriving in Brazil in the north. They have not been able to access health, to access education, to be employed, or any of that. Obviously, because they are threatened by sexualized forms of violence, there needs to be more, attention paid to that. And sometimes it's very simple ones. There was, let's call it an epidemic of sexual violence in one of the displaced people's camp in one of the cities in the northern border of Brazil. The main reason being that it was very dark and the bathroom was one beside the other. So there needs to be also some planning when you're building a camp. There needs to be light. Bathroom, the male and the female cannot be one beside the other because you're going to put them under risk. So we see that.
Can I just come in there? I mean, you mentioned the camp, and the reason why I want to come in here is that because of the recent migrations, we almost have like 3 million who've come out of Ukraine into Europe, and they didn't set up camps. They actually were welcomed into homes. So for me, that is obviously you don't want to see women and children face that situation, but at least if they're going to be traumatized by conflict, at least they're going into a home where they're secure and safe, rather than to a camp and face other forms of potential conflict, traumas and sexual violence and all the things that happen to women and children in this unsafe environment. And to me, that's a step forward rather than step back. At least you're mitigating. I have seen outcries from other parts in MENA, Africa, that, when people from our areas, left their homes, they had to go into camps. But at least maybe this could be a precedent for the future, that if people are forced to migrate because of conflict or climate, they're not put into camps and having to face and made stateless and dehumanized, maybe this is the way forward at least. And maybe people will then start to think more in terms of prevention. I mean, if I can bring in Professor Achavan, in law, we always talk about prevention is better than cure. And if we're talking about, we can't cope with the kind of migrations that we're facing now, if we're talking about what climate change will force us into the numbers, how are we going to cope with those? So we really have to think ahead, and time is of the essence, Professor.
Yes, Neda. I'll begin with the small island states like Kiribati, which now have to plan for resettlement of their entire population. If your land territory is going to go under the sea in the foreseeable future, well, then you have to, in some cases, purchase land in another country or enter into an agreement with another country to allow your citizens a piece of the earth where they can continue to exist. And of course, when you have populations of 10,000, 30,000, that's relatively simple. But let's now look at the context of Bangladesh, with a population almost of 200 million. The Bengal Delta is sinking. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. It's very low lying, and there are estimates that some 60 or 70 million climate refugees may exist in Bangladesh alone. So getting back to what you said, yes, if we think that we have a problem with migration today, with people getting into rubber dinghies in the Mediterranean and risking death out of their desperation to search for a better life, we have seen nothing compared to what would happen if catastrophic climate change begins to create mass migration in the hundreds of millions. And we know that people who are desperate enough will always find a way around the highest wall, if necessary, in search of a better life for their family. So what I'm saying, it goes back to the earlier point of we need visionary but very concrete politics at the same time. We need political leaders who, instead of simply thinking about staying in power at any cost, are thinking about where humankind will be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. And in order to create that sort of dynamic in political thinking and transformation of policies and institutions, we need mass mobilization. We need the engagement of civil society on an unprecedented scale, in effect, to force those in positions of power to bring about that change before it's too late. And as I said, I am still fairly optimistic, not in the sense that the cynicism of power will not make very big mistakes, but I think that history is on the side of those that embrace and understand the interdependence of humankind. Once upon a time, the idea would have been some poetic dream, and people would have said, oh, yes, this is a wonderful utopia, but you have to be realistic. And when I was in the United Nations, we were talking about human rights. We would always be told by the cynics, oh, you have to be realistic. Well, I think the only realistic thing is to dramatically change our patterns of thought and behavior. This is the new realism. The new realism is that we live in a global village, and in a literal physical sense, that we can disregard the welfare of others only at the expense of our own welfare. So the quicker that understanding sinks in at all levels of society, not just among political elites, the quicker we can come out of the grips of this, gospel of greed and short-sightedness and narcissism and indifference towards the suffering of others. So it goes back fundamentally to this requiring a spiritual and cultural revolution, out of which will flow the differing institutions and policies and practices. And we cannot separate the two from each other. We need to change culture at the same time as we change laws and policies and institutions in elite circles.
You almost read my mind, because I was going to say for each one of you, because we're reaching the end, as a final thought, what it is that you think would be the catalyst. We've touched upon many things. We talked about equity, justice. We've talked about all the issues that women face and other people face in terms of risk, conflict and climate, what do you think would be the catalyst instead of just one thing that you think would change and bring us from where we are to a culture where we can actually embrace peace with everybody? Maybe if I can start with Renata and then end with Payam, and then we will end there. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very difficult, but Payam's words were very optimistic and inspirational, and I think I really need it. You know, I'm coming from a country where policies are being dismantled on purpose. So it's very nice. I think it's participation. Participation is key, and effective participation of women and these marginalized groups that are disproportionately affected by all the things that we're talking about here. They have these issues at heart, and they are definitely very capable of providing solutions for us. Now, the hard thing is to convince who actually is in power of their importance.
Thank you. And Payam, what would you say?
Well, I would agree with Renata. It's participation, and I would add that it's participation with a deep consciousness, a deep sense of responsibility. And I think time is on the side, history is on the side of those people that understand that we have an exhausted, bankrupt civilization, that this old world order, this old way of doing things no longer functions, no longer works, whether we like it or not. So we're witnessing extremes on the one hand of injustice and iniquity, but we also see very promising signs of radically new ideas about humankind, the structuring of society and world order and what have you. So I think that we need to see both the dark and the light interplaying with each other. So when we talk about regression in policies, let's say in Brazil, or the rise of populist hatred in the West and the strongman politics that we see, is that a long-term trend, or is it the dying convulsion of a bankrupt way of doing things? And you have these powerful, pathetic, narcissistic men who are desperately trying to hold on to a world that is in the midst of collapse. And I would think that that is what is going on, that these men may create a lot of havoc and suffering, but they're not going to win. In the long run, the forces which see the interdependence of humankind and understand the necessity of justice, time is on their side.
Thank you very much. It's been a very enjoyable discussion, and I hope all the people who are participants have enjoyed it as much as I have. I'm sure, people will realize we are in the middle of a women's conference, and women usually are the conscience of society. They feel the pain that they see. And when I see my friends, my colleagues, they're always in pain what's going on in Ukraine and everywhere else. And it's almost as if it's happening to them. So I think the voice of women should be more louder and permeate in every part of society, so that together as men and women, we can actually hopefully see the change that we would like to see in this world. Thank you very much to our participants. Thank you very much to our speakers. It has been most enlightening session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.